Welcome to session 182 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 1st of July. Today we'll be looking at Lamentations 3 and Psalm 27. But so far in Lamentations, we started the book and read through the first two poems. This book was written by someone who witnessed firsthand the destruction of Jerusalem and is now processing the suffering and brokenness that they saw. We saw this reflected in the violent imagery and language that they used. This book, much like many of the other books we've read, is not a clean and pretty book. It's raw, explicit and emotional. The more we try to clean up the Bible and make it pretty and easy to read, the more we actually dishonour the human emotions that the Bible is trying to speak and to heal. We talked about how the first four poems are acrostics, where each section starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. We read through the first poem, which was pictured Jerusalem as a widow who had lost her husband and children and was working through her pain. The brokenness and wickedness that she saw pointed her inwards to look at the brokenness and wickedness she'd expressed in her own life. Then we read through the second poem that focused on God's wrath, his righteous judgment against the continual wickedness of his people over centuries. But let's jump in with today's readings, Lamentations 3. We mentioned that the first four poems are acrostics, where the start of each verse was a different letter of the alphabet. The third poem changes this up slightly. It groups its verses into threes. So the first three verses will all start with the first letter of the alphabet, and then the second three verses will each start with the second letter, and so on. In this poem, we experience what all of the people of Judah went through the eyes of just one man. As this one man cries out, we see him go through 5 steps. The first step is to acknowledge his current suffering. He admits that he's being punished by God. His skin is wasting away. He is surrounded by bitterness. It feels like God has trapped him and is ignoring his prayers. Like God is a wild animal ready to tear him apart and pierce him through. He's laughed at and mocked. He has no peace or happiness. His soul is continually reminded of how awful his life is. And then comes the turning point. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Lamentations 3 verse 21. This man acknowledges his suffering, but doesn't allow himself to sit there. He brings himself to the second stage, reminding himself of the goodness of God. God is merciful and faithful. There is reason to hope. God is good to those who wait patiently on him. May the one who is suffering have patience, because God will not cause them to suffer forever. He is a God of compassion that cares deeply for his people. God will not allow injustice to reign. He is powerful and mighty. Nothing happens without his say-so. If it's the case that God is punishing someone for their wickedness, then why should they complain? This leads our speaker to step 3, looking inward for any sin or wickedness. If there is, turn away from it and turn back to God. Having acknowledged his sin, we now move to step 4, recognizing the consequences of our sin. In his justice, God has punished his people for their injustice. He has brought the enemies of his people to come and destroy them. So now the speaker will weep for his suffering. He is hunted, beaten and cast out. Which then brings us to the final stage, making big requests and trusting in God. Having recognised the reality of his suffering versus the reality of who God is, and having identified his own sin and the consequences of it, our speaker now asks God to break into this situation. His request is simple. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. That's Lamentations 3 verse 56. He asks God to hear him, to protect him, to remove those who are oppressing him. And he has every trust that God will do what he says he will do. This simple 5-step process is great for when we go through difficult times. Step 1, recognize the reality that the situation we're going through is hard. Step 2, remind ourselves of the truth of God's goodness. Step 3, identify the sin and brokenness in our lives that might need to change. Step 4, acknowledge the consequences that sin has had on our lives. And then step 5, ask God to break into our situation and trust that he will. This is a clear example of how we can implement the practice of lament into our own lives. That is Lamentations 3. And then let's look at Psalm 27. This psalm is attributed to King David and falls into the category of lament psalm, where the psalmist brings their struggles before God. While lament psalms normally start with the complaint and work towards declaring trust in God, this psalm opens on a foundation of trust. It is structured in a chiasm where the passage reflects itself, as though the psalmist lays out all the things they trust about God and then place their requests and struggles within that. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verse 1, the Lord is my strength. Verses 2 to 3, my enemies. Verse 4, let me dwell in the Lord's presence. Verse 5, the Lord will take me in. Verse 6, 3 positive declarations. Verse 7, hear me. Verse 8, let me see you. Verse 9, 3 negative requests. Verse 10, the Lord will take me in. Verse 11, lead me in your ways. Verse 12, my enemies. And then verse 13 to 14, be strong in the Lord. The psalm opens with a declaration that the Lord is the psalmist's strength. Because of this strength, it doesn't matter what their enemies or opponents throw at them. They will not stumble or fear because they have God. Next, the psalmist stands their ground on something they have been asking God for a while, that they might stand in his presence. They can have confidence in this because the Lord is the one who gathers and protects his people. Because of the Lord, there are 3 things the psalmist can now do. They can hold their head high, they can make their offerings with joy, and they can sing praise to God. With this foundation laid, the psalmist then asks God to hear their prayers. This is where the psalm begins to reflect itself. They ask God to hear them and then ask that they might see God. They had stated 3 things they can do because of God and now ask God not to do these 3 things: hide his face, turn the psalmist away in his anger, and cast the psalmist out of his presence. They once again state the truth that the Lord is a God who gathers and protects those that are his, and ask the Lord to lead them in his ways. Finally, they make one more request, that they may not be handed over to their enemies, and then ends where they began. The Lord is their strength. Through this psalm, we see how a proper understanding of who God is can lead us to make big asks that God not forsake us. Instead, we can seek him to lead us and protect us in our struggles. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.